I know which day she will go to hospital to see Miss Lu.
Yeah.
And then after he returned, and I call him up, say that this is Bruce, okay, and how was the visit. But every time I go to different AI members' house to use their phone.
Oh, okay.
I'm not using my own phone.
They know that, huh?
Yeah. And so every time I use different family's phone number, and yeah.
You talked to her in Taiwanese?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That we stood up to help the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why, I think she's also very brave. 1982.
Yeah.
She smuggled this out to us, and it's addressed to the AI member.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she didn't write Bruce, but she knew your voice already from several times.
Right. Yeah.
So she went to see her sister every week in the prison.
Right.
And you would call her weekly, huh?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then James Moyes.
Of course, yeah.
He translates this into English, and so that we have a wider distribution.
So you gave it to Seymour, yeah.
Right, yeah. So we are not
What's
just.
the date on this? Yeah.
This is it's January 29, but the translation is February 12.
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna see him 2 weeks from now.
Oh really?
Yeah, he comes to Taiwan very often.
Oh okay.
He comes to Taiwan and watches this very often.
Okay. Yeah, we don't just work among ourselves. We work with other people too.
Yeah. Okay.
And
who is this? Oh, this is the assistant of Jack Anderson. 6.
Yeah. So eventually, after we push AI to invest the case, they eventually adopt all of them.
They adopted all of them. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And this is an official letter answer from the Taiwan's so-called embassy in the US.
CCNA to Gail Baker. Huh?
Right. Yeah. And this is a Chen Fu.
Oh yeah. Well, you could do it a little more like chronologically, like starting from what happened before the Kaohsiung incident, and then when you get to after the Kaohsiung incident, spread off to Dan, what he did at that time.
Whatever you want.
Do you have a question or no?
Oh, I don't know too much about that period, so I don't.
Yeah.
I don't have an organized question.
Okay, so we could also talk a little bit about how the Taiwanese overseas felt too, and how some involvement started, right?
Yeah. Well, when the Kaohsiung incident happened, the first thing is we prepare petition letter like this, and in New Mexico, we get 319 signature, and we send this to President Carter, Secretary of State, and all the member of Foreign Relations Committee member in both Senator and Congress, and we get response from everybody, and particularly like this one is a response from State Department on behalf of President Carter, and it's a 2-page response. It's not just a simple few sentences. Try to get away with it. And
wait. Let me see both of those things a little bit more. Just hold it up for me.
Okay. Diga. Okay.
Petition.
Okay.
And the card too.
Okay.
And this one.
Does he have a signature from Carter? Is there like the second page?
Yeah, it's got Harding Carter. It's the secretary, assistant secretary. It's a different Carter, but it's Harding Carter.
Okay.
And then in okay.
Yeah, this is a good card. Yeah.
AI Group 101, that is AI Group in New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico. We send out 20,000 postcards like this to all the AI members around the world to sign their name to send it to Taiwan to help the release of Miss Lu and Anita Lu Xiulian.
Okay, how?
Yeah. And okay, so maybe I'll start talking from explaining the background of the Kaohsiung incident. And I think it's important to understand that Taiwan society was very, very repressed from 1947 on, from the big massacre of 1947 on. And people were picked up and questioned and arrested for very slight expressions of discontent, and sometimes they went to jail for 10 or 15 years for just some very slight criticism of the government. So it was really quite an effort for the movement to get off the ground. But by the 1970s, the early 70s, Taiwan's position in the world became more and more into question. So, for example, that's 1971. That's when, about the time that I knew Zhang Xidian, but at that time his English name was Bruce, when we were studying in the United States. And I think for the Taiwanese overseas, that period, 1971 on, was quite a shock. Maybe you can describe it a little.
Yeah, because people like me, my family came from, go through the experience of 228 284变. So we are really scared about the situation in Taiwan. We were afraid to speak out our own mind, and we are just worried about what if we speak out something, our family back home may be prosecuted. So we are all very quiet, try not to say anything against the government. It's really scary, even we are already out of the country.
Yeah, but then I think people were scared, but they became more and more worried because from 1970 on, when Nixon sent Kissinger to China and Nixon went to China, it was clear that sooner or later the Republic of China would not be recognized as the lawful government of China, which many Taiwanese did not want the KMT anyway. But people were very afraid that Taiwan would be turned over to the People's Republic of China without any chance for the Taiwanese to determine their own future. So, at that time, if you were, talked in favor of the PRC, you were suppressed. If you talked in favor of Taiwan independence, you were suppressed.
Right.
But it came closer and closer to the point that people felt if they did not speak out, their whole future and their next generation, their next generation's future would be decided by the great powers.
That's true. And in 1979, there was a major election for the parliamentary election. And many people, just like Linda just mentioned about, they're really worried about the future of Taiwan. So they came to participate in the election. One of them is Anita Lu. She just graduated from Harvard Law School, and she came to back to Taiwan to run for the election.
Yeah. Let me correct this a little bit. The election actually was December 1978.
Already?
Yeah, it was December. It was the end of the year. And everyone was preparing for this from actually 78. But even earlier, in 1977, after the Zhongli incident, a crowd burned down the police station because of KMT tampering with the ballots. So after that riot, which was the first riot since 228, right? Everyone thought that finally they might have a chance that the ballots are really going to be fairly counted. And so there was like a big mobilization for that election, and I think really the first time there was a public reaction. And you told me that you were actually involved early in 1979, before the Kaohsiung incident.
Yeah, there was a Yu Denghua incident. Yu Denghua is actually Kaohsiung mayor at that time, right?
He was his family had controlled the county politics of Kaohsiung for quite a while, and he had joined up with the opposition.
Right, yeah. And so the government arrests him, and at that time when the government arrests anybody, they usually just put the name of sedition. You try to overthrow the government, and say that he tried to work with mainland China to overthrow the KMT government. And it's really just ridiculous to most of Taiwanese people, because Taiwanese people just don't think will work with Communist China to overthrow the KMT. And so in the Taiwanese students in the U.S., we immediately mobilize and get together in Chicago, and we collect $20,000 donation, and also get a lot of signature from Professor, Nobel Prize laureate, and famous people, and we publish advertisement in the Washington Post.
Let's get this article out.
Yeah.
And I think you have to see this from the point of view that Yu Dongfa was a well-known figure at that time who had joined up with the island-wide opposition in Taiwan. That at that time Shih Ming-teh, at that time Shih Ming-teh was the general secretary of the campaign coalition, and of course Yao Zhaowen and Huang Xingjie were all very active in this, and Ling Yisheng, whose family was later murdered. So this was really early '79, was a new, more aggressive period of organization of the opposition, even though the elections had been called off. Yeah.
And this is a advertisement in the Washington Post. And for a whole page advertisement like this, it's very expensive. And it's all by the effort of the Taiwanese student, not the business person, by the student, all their effort to go out solicit a donation to collect the $20,000 to publish this advertisement.
I think you should note the organization that did this is the Organization for the Support of the Democratic Movement in Taiwan, which at that time was headed by Lin Shaoxin, who is generally considered to be pro-China. At that time was considered to be pro-China, but he's native Taiwanese, and so early in the movement, it was really people who were against KMT rule, whether they were in favor of Taiwan independence or whether they were in favor of union with China. All of them were united together in this human rights effort.
You want to go ahead and read the title? You may not be able to see.
Okay, well here is the title is Fully Support Democratic Movement in Taiwan. Strongly...
This way.
Huh? Oh.
Sorry, my angle's bad.
Bad, okay. So the title here is Fully Support Democratic Movement in Taiwan. Strongly condemn political oppression. Immediately release the Yus. That was Yu Dongfa and his son. But of course at that time I was in Taiwan together with... You're not finished?
The
Okay.
Washington, I just realized I gotta get the Washington Post in there. And
Where's...
the date.
Okay.
It's at the top right
The Washington Post, it's very small here, but it says the Washington Post, February 16th, 1979. And at that time, Yu Dongfa and his son were on trial in Taipei and were being accused of being involved with the Chinese communists, which of course was what the government always would say. Anyone who criticized the KMT, they would say, was an arm of the communists, which is a complete lie. It was really a complete lie. And even when the democratic movement organized for elections, they would always say criticism of the government is the communists' line. So they would make people very afraid, because if you were a communist associated with communists, you could be put in jail for at least 7 years, and probably 10 or 15 years, just for basically your political position. And how can we continue from this? So,
second page of the ad.
yeah, this is a lot of signatures
All
here.
the signature
I see
from the
that.
famous people, Professor, Nobel laureate.
Yeah. So this is, yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Well, this is very early on. This is before the Kaohsiung incident. Already the Taiwanese overseas were increasing were increasing their level of connection with the democratic movement in Taiwan. So the overseas Taiwanese were an extremely important base and support for the emergence of the democratic movement in Taiwan. And we have to give some credit also to the human rights position of Jimmy Carter. This also gave a lot of encouragement to the democratic movement, and for a while it scared the KMT. For a while the KMT didn't quite know what to do with this. They thought maybe Carter and his administration were serious about human rights. So they didn't quite, the KMT I think didn't dare to totally crack down for quite a while until they found a good excuse. And of course that excuse finally was the Kaohsiung incident. The democratic movement was holding bigger and bigger rallies under martial law conditions, you know, surrounded by police, sometimes by tanks, people with guns. Once we met in a school and there were machine guns. We were in a schoolyard, and there were machine guns on the roof of the second floor that, you know, they could have begun shooting people any moment. 200 riot police in the back. But they didn't really have an excuse to totally crack down and arrest everyone until you could say it was a police-instigated riot in Kaohsiung. That's December 10th, 1979, Human Rights Day, when we were in fact just setting up a human rights organization. Well, how should we go on from there? So after that incident,
I must want to ask the reason. Also, one of the reasons for the Kaohsiung incident was maybe 2-3 weeks ago, before the incident, Jimmy Carter government recognized mainland China as a.
No, you're wrong on the date. That was 1 year earlier.
1 year early?
Yeah, it was before he recognized it was before the Yu Dunfa arrest. So it was the Jimmy Carter recognized the PRC December 16th, 1978. He announced that he would recognize, and the new relations would begin 1 year ahead. So then the Chiang Ching-kuo canceled the elections. He canceled the 78, the end of 78.
The end of 78?
The end of 78. So that's when we began to mobilize. And then the government arrested Yu Dunfa, who was going to bankroll. He was going to bankroll the new phase of the movement. So they arrested Yu Dunfa. But although Yu Dunfa was arrested, the movement didn't stop, and it began another phase of direct confrontation with martial law. So it was 1 year later. It was 1 year later that the Kaohsiung incident happened.
That is kind of different from my recollection, because I thought, because the stop of the election, that's why people get angry.
Well, yes, but it was a whole year of movement. It was a whole year from the stop of the election to the Kaohsiung incident. And in that time, the democratic movement was continually calling for the right of the people of Taiwan to determine their own future, or basically the return to elections, the re-election of the central government, end of martial law. So the issue the whole time was the right of the people of Taiwan to determine their whole future. But the KMT didn't find the occasion to crack down until the end of December, or the beginning of December. And they tried several times to crack down, and the movement reacted. So it took a year before they cracked down, and then they arrested everybody. You know, I mean, all the leadership.
Okay, so you sure it's
yes.
recognized 1 year before?
Oh yeah,
before
yeah.
Okay,
yeah. But they didn't formalize. Jimmy Carter announced that in the end of 78 that they would recognize the PRC, but that the formal relations didn't take effect until 1 year later.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so that's why there's some confusion, but the political effect was at the end of 78.
So, Chiang Ching-kuo stopped the election in 78.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why. And then after that, all these candidates were left hanging, and there was no process for 2 years. Actually, the elections were postponed for 2 years. Okay, so where do we go from there?
I want to show this flyer is we invite Linda Arrigo to New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico, to give a talk as a fundraising for Amnesty International Group 101 in New Mexico.
Yeah, so let me go back a little from there. So on the night of the Kaohsiung incident, it was an incredible scene. You know, there were probably at least 100,000 people, and then all the trucks, the riot trucks closing in with tear gas and all that, and it was quite a struggle. And then a few days later, my husband and all the other leadership was arrested, and I was deported on December 15th, 1979, the end of the year. And the prisoners were all held incommunicado. They couldn't talk to anyone, but we knew that they were probably being tortured. And it was, of course, a great mobilization among the Taiwanese overseas, starting from that time, because everyone was terribly concerned about what was happening. Actually, there were several hundred people arrested, not just those that were later charged. And then you went into action with Amnesty International, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I present this case to the Amnesty International, but at that time there's already publicity in New York Newsweek, Times, and Taiwanese government, KMT government already sent out information, talk about this is the situation of riot. And but the Amnesty people member in Albuquerque, they feel that what I told them is the true story, that it's a suppression of the human right rather than a right against the government. So they decided to step in to help the case, and that's why we start to work on the case and start to publish the postcard to send out to AI members around the country to support the case.
And yeah, so it was very important. At that time, the Taiwanese all mobilized to call congressmen and senators, and Edward Kennedy was one of the people you had contact with at that time.
Right. And eventually, the AI adopt this case. Not only the Miss Lu that was adopted by Group 101 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but all the other Kaohsiung Institute member, and send out an official notice to the AI group around the world to adopt all the prisoners in this case, and also their letters.
Yeah.
Hold on, let me film this for a while. There's a lot of names on this.
Yeah. You want to read the name?
Well, let's see. Those who were in jail at that time were Chen Ju, who's now head of the Labor Department, Huang Xingjie, who was chairman of the DPP in 1990, Gao Junming is the General Secretary of the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan, Ling Yixiong, who was a provincial assemblyman, and of course the important issue is that in February 28th, 1980, his mother and his daughters were murdered by an assailant who was never caught. Ling Yixiong.
I'm sorry, wasn't his wife?
His wife was not killed. No,
Oh.
his wife was out at that time,
Oh, okay.
visiting him in prison.
I'm
No.
totally mistaken about that.
His mother and his three daughters were all stabbed, but the older daughter survived. And then also Lu Shoulian was particularly the prisoner that was adopted by Zhang Xidian's group, Amnesty International group. And of course she's the vice president now. It shows how things have changed. And then Shih Ming-teh was also adopted. He was a former political prisoner, had been in jail for 15 years before this case, and then was jailed again with the sentence of life. And I was married to him from 1978. So I was married to him for quite a long time, actually.
Okay, so these countries are the places where we've adopted them. That's what Amnesty
Oh, yeah.
International does. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Amnesty International sent the information for these various prisoners to Amnesty International groups in different countries, and then they would write letters to the Taiwan government. And I'd say this was the first time that so-called Free China, Republic of China, had received so much international pressure. And because the United States was then just recognizing and increasing relations with the People's Republic, so they were quite concerned about this international publicity. And this is probably a very important reason why these people were not executed, why these prisoners were not executed. Because by earlier standards, they most certainly would have been executed. And there was also pressure within Taiwan society as well as overseas. But so much of this response overseas came because the Taiwanese in the United States, thousands of Taiwanese in the United States, made an incredible effort. And generally, like Dan here, Zhang Xidian himself, was very careful about not appearing publicly. He was behind the scenes, and he would ask the American members of the Amnesty International group to appear in public. But still, the KMT found out that he was involved, and you were on the blacklist for how many years?
For 10 years, yeah.
Yeah, 10 years, yeah. Well, I believe there were thousands of people, I think at least 3,000, 5,000 or so, Taiwanese overseas who were marked, were identified by the government spies as being involved in the human rights effort, and were not allowed to come back to Taiwan for 10, 20 years, some even longer. And of course this is quite a tragedy for many people, because their parents passed away without them ever having to see them, ever being able to see them again. And sometimes they were separated from their spouses, separated from their children, and yeah, it's quite a tragedy all over to realize how much people's lives could be interfered with, and sometimes the relatives were physically attacked. I met people who were warned, and then their mothers would be like hit 2 times in a row by a motorcycle and seriously injured. It's white terror, really.
Yeah, and I also particularly want to show this article is by columnist Jack Anderson. The AI Group 101 in Albuquerque, New Mexico provide him with information, and also Linda Arrigo also has talked to him about some of the information. So eventually he write the article, and because he's a well-known columnist, his article was published in about 1,000 newspapers around the country. And so this has a major impact to our case. We were eventually able to get our prisoner of conscience released because of this publicity.
Yeah, so the Taiwan government finally began to release these prisoners in 1985. And Lu Shoulian, Annette Lu, was rather seriously ill because she had throat cancer before, thyroid cancer, yeah. Right. And they released her in 1985?
Right, yeah. They released in 1985, and the AI Group 101 in Albuquerque, New Mexico helped her secure a scholarship from Harvard Law School. And so she was able to come to Harvard Law School to study for 1 year, and that kind of get away from the KMT government until she was officially released. At that time, she released from the jail in 1985. That was a medical release.
Yeah.
That means if she recovers, she need to go back to prison.
Yeah, but all of these prisoners were not fully released until 1990.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Shih Ming-teh was in for another 10 years in addition to the 15 years that he had served before, and it wasn't until May of 1990 when Li Denghui became the president, elected by still the old National Assembly, but he became president and declared the release of most of the political prisoners, almost all of them. And then I was finally able to come back to Taiwan, and Shih Ming-teh and some of the other long-standing prisoners were released finally at that time.
Okay.
Okay.
Go on.
Is that enough, or do you have questions from you? Should we talk about how the you might say how the okay, go on. Well, I think many people think that Taiwan liberalized in 1987, which was the end of martial law when Chiang Ching-kuo finally lifted martial law. But I don't really think that's the right way to look at it. For one thing, they didn't willingly. The KMT definitely didn't willingly lift martial law. You know, this stuff about that Raymond Myers would say that Chiang Ching-kuo was the initiator of democracy. I mean, that's totally ridiculous. And people were laying down their lives, going to jail, defying martial law for nearly a decade, when finally they lifted martial law legally because they couldn't enforce it anymore. But I mean, what did the KMT try to do? They put into effect the national security laws, 国安法. So I mean, it was a sleight of hand, you know, like supposedly lifting martial law, but putting into effect national security laws that did almost the same thing. So if it weren't for people still defying those laws and pushing, Taiwan would not have liberalized. And even in 1987, the blacklist was still in effect. They were still arresting people through the early 90s. And there was no election. There was really no free elections until the 1990s, until really 1993.
What's the story behind that?
Yeah.
Okay. Chiang Ching-kuo, that he was a president to arrest Li Xiulian, and but a couple years before that, he was a premier of the country. And when Li Xiulian returned from Harvard School, made the Harvard Law School, he worked in the Minister of 行政院怎么讲?
He was the premier, head of the executive yuan.
Right, but she worked there.
Hold it up more.
Yeah.
No.
Well, she worked for the executive yuan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, she worked there. So actually, she worked under Chiang Ching-kuo. So on one of the birthday occasion, she represent the people who born in the month, cut the cake with Chiang Ching-kuo. Okay, so we use this picture for our postcard to show the people who cut the cake with Miss Lu. Right now is put her in jail and try to sentence her to death because she accused her to try to overthrow the government.
Yeah, but we need a little social background of this, and that is that much of the opposition to the Kuomintang were Taiwanese who had joined the Kuomintang earlier, including Li Xiulian, well-educated people, but people who saw the contradictions within the Kuomintang itself and wanted the Kuomintang to liberalize. So Li Xiulian finished law school. She went to work for the appeals section of the executive yuan, and that's how she happened to be cutting the cake for Chiang Ching-kuo. She was a member of the Kuomintang. She started off the feminist movement about that time in the early 70s. But as she really began to get into social issues, she was kicked out. Then she was ostracized from the Kuomintang for taking on any kind of a social issue. So you might say that the people who were involved in social improvement, in social liberation of some kind, women's liberation, were forced together with the direct political opposition. And she's such a case. I think Li Xiulian and a lot of other people like Zhang Junhong, they really wanted to be reformers within the KMT. But the KMT is so tremendously paranoid, it couldn't accept any kind of challenge, especially from native Taiwanese.
Case.
Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, when Amnesty adopted prisoner conscience, Amnesty International will send out a piece of paper like this, introduce this prisoner, and also tell us where to send the petition letter to. So at the bottom is the address of the person that we should send a petition letter to. Okay. When the
Okay, go ahead.
when the Kaohsiung incident happened, I am in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We get 319 petition and to send it to President Jimmy Carter. And also in the petition, I enclosed this data to President Jimmy Carter, talk about the incident, and hopefully he will come out to help those people that was arrested. And so this is a first letter to Jimmy Carter, and also we also send a copy to the Foreign Relations Committee member, both in the Senate and Congress, and ask for their help. So this was the activity we did in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Okay. Wait, I'm sorry, could I see the date on that again? Sorry.
Okay. That's January 30th.
Okay,
And with our letter to the Senator and Congress member in the Foreign Relations Committee, we get extensive response from all those members. And like this letter is a response from Senator Ted Kennedy. And it's not just a few sentences, it's a 2-page reply to our request.
Okay, can I see the second page?
Mr. Lee is waiting for us, and he wants us to go right away because he's busy at 4.
Okay.
So
Just get the second page.
yeah, did you take the other picture there? We can